Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Hurricane Harvey's trail of devastation in the heart of the US oil industry. Also this week, remember the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa hold their 9th Emerging Markets Summit. But can the bloc exert an economic force in 2017? Plus, conservationists sound the alarm in the Amazon. A vast reserve in Brazil is at risk of being carved up by mining, and in neighboring Bolivia, a highway through a pristine rainforest is planned. All week long, we've been seeing footage of dazed evacuees gathering in flood shelters in the US state of Texas. Hurricane Harvey has forced nearly 2 million people from their homes in population-dense Houston, America's 4th largest metropolitan area. Scores of people have lost their lives, and the final bill for reconstruction that Texas will have to face in the weeks, months and years to come is still unclear. Preliminary estimates put the economic cost at $190 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster in US history. That figure amounts to a full 1% of US GDP. Many people with waterlogged homes and businesses have no flood insurance. And if you don't have any insurance, then charity and government aid from the taxpayer-funded Federal Emergency Management Agency is your only option. Well, the concentration of US energy assets in this low-lying area means that there are also big implications for the global oil and gas industry. Harvey swamped 1/3 of US refining capacity. It could be weeks before refineries return to full operation, so there are huge concerns about fuel supplies, and the US is the world's largest oil consumer. This explains why the price of refined products like gasoline are jumping higher. Prices for US crude, though, are heading in the other direction. That's because disruptions are keeping refineries from buying oil to make products like jet fuel, diesel and gasoline. Harvey, which was the most powerful storm to hit Texas in half a century, shut the Colonial Pipeline carrying fuel from the Gulf Coast refining hub to the East Coast, Europe and Mexico, who also import fuel from the Gulf of Mexico. And it's also worth noting, this is the first major storm to test US shale since drilling took off around a decade ago. The Permian Basin is the largest US shale field, and pipelines there have been shut. So big questions about how quickly that sector can make a comeback. Well, the petrochemical plant in Crosby is just one of many hazards that the Gulf Coast of Texas faces after Harvey. Even though it lies at the center of America's oil and gas industry, Houston has no zoning law and, according to watchdogs, minimal oversight on industrial pollution. As Shihab Ratanzi reports now, this all makes dealing with the aftermath of Harvey even more of a challenge.
The Gulf Coast is full of neighborhoods like this one in Port Arthur, where children play among the smokestacks of refineries and petrochemical plants. Al Jazeera visited this town before it was flooded by Tropical Storm Harvey. It's in the shadow of the US's largest oil refinery. Port Arthur is nicknamed Cancer Alley due to its residents' elevated levels of cancer and respiratory problems. And despite Saudi Aramco's assertions that toxic emissions have been cut drastically at this plant, local residents aren't convinced.
When I come outside and I hit a bell, I'd be like, oh, they released something. And I'd go in the house and close the door back.
Harvey has meant the refinery has shut down, along with many other oil, gas and petrochemical installations on the Gulf. And when operations are halted, the companies then burn off excess chemicals straight into the air. Over the last few days, the Environmental Defense Fund has looked into these industries' filings to regulators and has calculated that more than 2 million pounds of hazardous fumes have been released into the air since Harvey. The problem is there's no way to independently verify those regulatory submissions. The region's air quality monitors were all switched off to avoid storm damage, and environmental groups are skeptical.
I don't think that historically we can trust what industry is telling us in terms of what has been emitted. I think even if you look at the Exxon Baytown facility recent judgment in terms of violating the Clean Air Act over 16,000 times, I think that tells a very good story.
Texas prides itself on being business-friendly. Cities like Houston don't even have official zoning laws, which is one reason why low-income communities live adjacent to the toxic smokestacks, and why so many plants are built in locations vulnerable to coastal flooding.
Here we see the center of the oil refining industry itself being impacted by our addiction to oil.
Politicians in both Texas and Washington, D.C. say now is not the time for environmental politics. But a storm of Harvey's ferocity had long been predicted by climate scientists when the sky was clear, with little interest from those same politicians, which is why many argue now is exactly the time for a debate about regulation and climate change. Shia Britansi, Al Jazeera, Beaumont, Texas.
Joining us now from London is Amrita Sen. Amrita is co-founder and chief oil analyst at London-based Energy Aspects. Amrita, good to have you with us on Counting the Cost. Are we likely to see fuel shortages of refined gasoline products on the east coast of the States, in Europe, as a result of Harvey?
I think there will be some fuel shortages locally, for sure. And as a result of that, you are seeing Europe now ship a lot of gasoline over to the United States and over to Latin America as well. The US usually sends diesel to Europe. It doesn't send gasoline. It's the other way around. Europe sends gasoline over to the US. There's obviously been severe disruptions in the products market. Nearly 4 million barrels per day of refining capacity was offline till yesterday. Some refineries are coming back. That will help. The EPA in the US has also waived a lot of the specification tightness. So that will again help, because then even off-spec material can be delivered into the US. But yes, right now, the major pipeline that goes from the US Gulf Coast, where Hurricane Harvey hit, to the US East Coast has been shut because they don't have enough products to supply. And therefore, it is likely what you're going to see is that inventories are drawn down a lot. Right now, there's enough in stock, but if it persists for longer, then there's a risk of shortages. It's not there right now.
This, of course, is the area where most of the US's oil and gas industry is based. How vital is it to the US economy?
Oh, it's extremely vital because, as you said, this is the majority of US refining. US is now a major oil exporter, oil products exporter, gasoline and diesel. So I would say that obviously it's very, very detrimental for Texas and the US economy, but even more so for global markets and global petrol and diesel prices. This is very important. You've already seen global gasoline and diesel prices soar on the back of this, because now the world relies on US supplies of these products. So you are going to get a knock-on impact globally as well.
So does that, I mean, there is this disconnect, isn't there, between the price of crude at the moment, which is falling, and, as you say, gas prices, which are going up. Why is there that disconnect?
The reason there is a disconnect between crude oil and products prices is because the refineries themselves have been affected by the flooding from Harvey, and therefore they can't process the crude. So at the end of the day, demand for crude comes from refineries, and because they are down, they can't take that crude in. So there is an oversupply of crude in the short term, but at the same time, they can't produce the petrol and the diesel and the gasoline, and that's why you've got gasoline and diesel prices going up very, very sharply.
Can the industry based in that part of the United States recover from this, from the damage to the infrastructure? Is the cost of getting back online and back up to speed going to be too great?
And again, this is something we need to wait and see, because we have had severe damages in the past, in 2005 when Katrina and Rita hit, and then during Ike in 2008 as well. The issue is that from Hurricane Harvey landfalling, there hasn't been a significant amount of damage done to refineries, which is the good news. The bad news is that flooding actually can cause far more sustainable damage, because if you've got water in your pumps or in your cokers, that can take a lot longer and potentially can be quite dangerous when you're restarting. And I think that's the worry right now, is that the flood waters haven't receded yet, and you can actually see potentially some refineries, like during Katrina, that were offline for 10 months as a result. You could see some prolonged outages.
Amrita, really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, there's an annual summit and a catchy acronym, but when it comes to emerging markets, many question the relevance of the so-called BRICS bloc. In a few moments, Adrian Brown reports from China as the 9th BRICS summit gets underway. But first, here's Sohail Rahman reporting from New Delhi on why India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be attending this year's summit.
India has a $50 billion trade deficit because of products like this that are made in China, and the much wider market of electronic goods such as televisions, laptops and computers sold in markets like this. And that's what the Indian Prime Minister will want to address in his meetings with the other BRICS leaders in China over the weekend. India's position is very important because it also exports most of its manufactured goods abroad. And in the current international climate where the US is being quite protectionist and resistant to having international goods enter its market, the BRICS nations, including India, will want to try and find a way forward to break that embargo for the moment. However, India and China also need to try and talk politics on the sidelines of what's happening currently in the northeast of the country. The recent spat on the border between Bhutan and China has involved India, and such territorial disputes also have an impact on the economy of both countries. Both are powerhouses in Asia, and for the moment, their meeting in China will want to end with one that tells the rest of the world that they can certainly work together regardless of their diplomatic bumps.
Back when BRICS held its first summit back in 2009, China's economic growth was double what it is now. But then, as now, many people are still confused about exactly what BRICS is. Well, simply, it's the acronym for 5 of the world's leading developing economies. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, on paper, this is a group with an awful lot of financial clout. They account for about 20% of global GDP and more than 40% of the world's population. Now, back in 2009, the group had the lofty aim of wanting to offer an alternative vision to the Western dominance of global affairs. This year, the organization has another bold aim to try to work out how to lift global economic growth. But it's going to be difficult. The organization is in trouble. All of its member countries have had a difficult 12 months, including China, which of course is the engine of global economic growth, and Russia and Brazil are only now emerging from recession. Potentially, though, there could be the most interest in what happens on the sidelines of this summit. Will China's president meet India's prime minister, now that the two countries appear to have temporarily resolved their tense border standoff? But China won't want relations with India to overshadow a conference that it believes is important not just for China, but also for the world.
Joining us now from London is Alex Wolff. Alex is the senior emerging markets economist, usually based in Hong Kong, working with Standard Life Investments. Good to have you with us, Alex. What does China want to achieve by holding this summit?
Well, the BRICS, it's a China-led initiative. And by hosting this summit and by resolving some of the differences they have with India, they're hoping, I think, to make progress, especially on the One Belt, One Road. That's what I think will probably be a primary focus. It's one of Xi Jinping's top priorities, and by bringing these countries together, especially India, it's the opportunity to make progress on that initiative.
At the turn of the century, they were supposed to be, of course, the economic engines of the future, and as you've just pointed out, that hasn't been the case for various reasons. Which of these nations, though, do you think has the potential to meet the expectations that were placed upon them all back at the turn of the millennium?
Well, I think China has in many ways met the expectations that were put on China, especially if you go back to the year 2000 and the start of this millennia. They've experienced extremely rapid growth. They've raised incomes. They have moved up the value chain, and they have now assumed a much larger responsibility in global affairs, both economic and geopolitical. I think looking forward, India has to be the one that you're looking at. From a demographic perspective, it's roughly where China was when it experienced its boom in terms of growing labor supply. Of course, it still is a relatively poor country, so it has a lot of catch-up growth potential. And the reform direction, the reform initiatives taken by Modi and his government, they're moving in the right direction. They are making progress. So I think India is probably the one you want to look at.
But Alex, I mean, China's economy, of course, at the moment is slowing. Is China's motive here? It intends to use the BRICS nations as leverage, if you like, to benefit its economy.
Yeah, that's a more cynical way of looking at it, but I don't think it's totally inaccurate. A lot of the initiatives that China is leading, and BRICS is just one of them. I think in some ways it leaves countries kind of initiative. You get initiative fatigue. There's of course there's the APEC summit, there's the BRICS summit, now there's One Belt, One Road, and there's a summit attached with that. And there are a lot of these summits that in some ways they lose relevance. So I think they're really trying to maintain some relevance around this particular summit. But as you mentioned, these China-led initiatives, and as the U.S. and the Trump administration are pulling back from a leadership role in world affairs, China is trying to step into that role. But how it benefits other countries is definitely less clear. If it's purely for China's gain or it's more win-win, I think is yet to it's yet to be made clear.
Alex, really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, still to come on Counting the Cost, how global warming is threatening something that many of us can't do without, our daily cup of coffee. But first, a report from Bolivia where President Evo Morales is being criticized for backing a plan to build a highway through a remote national park. Daniel Schweimler reports now from Beni Department in Bolivia.
This is Tipnis, pristine forests, abundant wildlife and indigenous communities barely touched by modern life. Some believe it's idyllic and should be left alone, but others want change. They want a road linking them to the rest of Bolivia.
We are cattle ranchers and want to produce wheat to be farmers, but it hurts us that when we try to take our opportunities to connect with the rest of the country, voices of opposition are raised.
Successive Bolivian governments have promised the road they said would bring jobs and development, would cut journey times and get produce to markets. They never delivered. President Evo Morales says he will. Josefina and her 5 children, one more due this month, have been cutting yucca. It's a long, tough walk home. Drivers don't find it much easier. The opposition to change is strong. These men leaving for a clandestine meeting deep in the forest to plan resistance to the project.
If the government is determined to trample over us, then we have no other option but to sacrifice our lives in defense of our rights as stated in the Constitution.
Riverboats take most people where they need to go. The opposition believes the road will allow developers to exploit the region's resources, leaving them with nothing. It's a debate that strikes at the heart of Bolivia and beyond. Whether to develop and exploit with the promise of greater prosperity and a better future, or to leave it be and protect a delicate ecosystem and a way of life unchanged for generations. Bolivia has one of the fastest growing economies in the region, and the government keen to include previously marginalised communities in that expansion, inspiring both hope and mistrust.
We're very happy because we're building a better future, a better tomorrow. We're seeing many projects that will improve our lives.
If they open the road, it will bring destruction. We know the government has special interests in Tipnis. We know they'll pollute the waters.
The answer to Bolivia's long-standing question, what price progress, remains both divisive and elusive.
Brazil's President Michel Temer wants to open up a vast area of untouched rainforest to mining companies. But there's an outcry from conservationists and a legal challenge. The Renca Reserve in the eastern Amazon is bigger than Denmark and is thought to be rich in gold and other minerals. It's also home to indigenous tribes. A Brazilian court on Wednesday suspended Temer's decree to remove a ban on private companies exploiting the area. Around 30% of it was to be opened up to mining to help boost the country's economy. Joining us now from Stockholm is Toby Gardner. Toby is the Senior Research Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. Welcome to Counting the Cost, Toby. What do you make of President Temer's plans to lift this ban?
Well, I think it's quite a chaotic process so far. The original decree only a week ago called for the abolition of this huge reserve area in the heart of the Amazon. And then earlier this week, there was a revoking of that decree and a new one put in place, which really had the same central message, but changed the language and was clearer about some environmental protections. And then only last night, as was reported by Al Jazeera, a federal judge has put a stay on this, an injunction on this decree. So currently, we don't quite know where it's going to go.
So what do you make of President Temer's insistence that economically it's vital to open up this area for the health, the economic health of Brazil?
So in principle, of course, Brazil has vast natural resources, including mineral resources, that are central to its economy. But what is vital is to not distinguish development from the environment. What we need and what Brazil has championed over the course of the last decade is being a global leader in sustainable development. Now, considering environmental protections and considering social protections, including for indigenous peoples, has to be central to the process of opening and exploiting new mineral reserves. And what unfortunately has been the case, and there is a number of precedents under Temer's administration, is the appropriate processes and due diligence has not been undertaken to ensure that the economic benefits that can be gained from these resources, such as the mining deposits in this area, are done so without incurring long-term environmental and social damage, also for Brazil's economy in the long term.
And what are the dangers, Toby, for both Brazil and for Bolivia that we were talking about a few moments ago, as they try to access resources? It's only understandable that economically they'll want to access these resources.
It's absolutely understandable, and I think what Brazil has within its reach is to capitalize upon the role that it was playing. Brazil is famous in environmental circles for having managed to reduce deforestation by over 80% between 2004 and 2012. And now we've seen it back on the rise again. And there's been a series of measures and presidential decrees that have been adopted by the Temer government that have overwritten decades of careful public engagement and due diligence processes to set in place a set of environmental protections that can ensure that the environment is protected whilst also allowing economic activities to take place. And what we need to see is that Brazil to be able to retake that mantle of environmental leadership once more and demonstrate that economic development can take place without incurring long-term environmental and social damage that will undermine the short-term benefits that mines such as this can deliver.
Toby, really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Now, Dara Khosrowshahi, Uber's new chief, wants to transform the ride-hailing company into a publicly listed one. But don't hold your breath. He's aiming to do it sometime between 2019 and 2021. Khosrowshahi, who was previously head of Expedia, was officially appointed Uber CEO only this week. The top spot at the company has been vacant since June after a series of sexual harassment scandals and months of turmoil. Uber is a venture capital-backed company at the moment, estimated to be worth around $68 billion. Finally this week, global warming is threatening something that many of us just can't do without our daily cup of coffee. Scientists say that rising temperatures are making more places unsuitable for plantations. The effects are already being felt in Ethiopia, the world's fifth largest producer, from where Charles Stratford reports.
Kebede Germano has been growing coffee for more than 20 years. But longer dry seasons, which experts say are a symptom of global warming, are an increasing concern for the 15 million Ethiopian farmers like him who rely on coffee for their livelihood.
The amount of coffee we can produce is fluctuating, especially when there is a lot of sun during the dry seasons in recent years.
Kebede has planted these false banana trees to provide shade for his young coffee plants underneath. And it's methods like these that are becoming increasingly important in this area and in other areas where coffee is grown in this country. A recent study says that up to 60% of the area in which coffee is grown in Ethiopia may be unsuitable to do so by the end of the century because of the effects of climate change. Coffee plants ideally need mild temperatures between 15 and 26 degrees Celsius to thrive. But farms, especially in lowland areas, are suffering from far higher temperatures. Some farmers there are growing alternative crops such as the stimulant cat, which is less dependent on rain. At this quality control centre, the beans from local farms are tested. They're graded for size, then roasted and ground before the coffee is tasted. A recent study said farmers in lowland areas could potentially increase their yields fourfold if they move to higher regions with a more suitable climate. And there's a lot at stake. Ethiopia is the largest producer of coffee in Africa. Exports were worth almost $900 million last year.
Coffee is the most important crop for this country. Coffee is also the country's biggest export earner. That's why the government is so focused on helping deal with the effects of climate change.
Ethiopians say their country is the birthplace of coffee. It's been drunk here for over 1,000 years. And global demand for coffee is increasing, but so are the challenges in growing it in countries where scientists say the effects of global warming are becoming worse.
And that's our show for this week. If there's anything you want to comment on, please get in touch with us. You can follow and tweet me. I'm at @afinnegan on Twitter. Please use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you can drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, even entire episodes for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next. Metropolitan area. Scores of people have lost their lives, and the final bill for reconstruction that Texas will have to face in the weeks, months and years to come is still unclear. Preliminary estimates put the economic cost at $190 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster in US history. That figure amounts to a full 1% of US GDP. Many people with waterlogged homes and businesses have no flood insurance. And if you don't have any insurance, then charity and government aid from the taxpayer-funded Federal Emergency Management Agency is your only option. Well, the concentration of US energy assets in this low-lying area means that there are also big implications for the global oil and gas industry. Harvey swamped 1/3 of US refining capacity. It could be weeks before refineries return to full operation, so there are huge concerns about fuel supplies, and the US is the world's largest oil consumer. This explains why the price of refined products like gasoline are jumping higher. Prices for US crude, though, are headed in the other direction. That's because disruptions are keeping refineries from buying oil to make products like jet fuel, diesel, and gasoline. Harvey, which was the most powerful storm to hit Texas in half a century, shut the Colonial Pipeline carrying fuel from the Gulf Coast refining hub to the East Coast, Europe and Mexico, who also import fuel from the Gulf of Mexico. And it's also worth noting, this is the first major storm to test US shale since drilling took off around a decade ago. The Permian Basin is the largest US shale field, and pipelines there have been shut. So big questions about how quickly that sector can make a comeback. Well, the petrochemical plant in Crosby is just one of many hazards that the Gulf Coast of Texas faces after Harvey. Even though it lies at the center of America's oil and gas industry, Houston has no zoning law and, according to watchdogs, minimal oversight on industrial pollution. As Shihab Ratanzi reports now,
more than 2 million pounds of hazardous fumes have been released into the air since Harvey. The problem is there's no way to independently verify those regulatory submissions. The region's air quality monitors were all switched off to avoid storm damage, and environmental groups are skeptical.
I don't think that historically we can trust what industry is telling us in terms of what has been emitted. I think even if you look at the Exxon Baytown facility recent judgment in terms of violating the Clean Air Act over 16,000 times, I think that tells a very good story.
Texas prides itself on being business-friendly. Cities like Houston don't even have official zoning laws, which is one reason why low-income communities live adjacent to the toxic smokestacks, and why so many plants are built in locations vulnerable to coastal flooding.
Here we see the center of the oil refining industry.
This all makes dealing with the aftermath of Harvey even more of a challenge.
The Gulf Coast is full of neighborhoods like this one in Port Arthur, where children play among the smokestacks of refineries and petrochemical plants. Al Jazeera visited this town before it was flooded by Tropical Storm Harvey. It's in the shadow of the US's largest oil refinery. Port Arthur is nicknamed Cancer Alley due to its residents' elevated levels of cancer and respiratory problems. And despite Saudi Aramco's assertions that toxic emissions have been cut drastically at this plant, local residents aren't convinced.
When I come outside and I hit a bell, I'll be like, oh, they released something. And I'll go in the house and close the door back.
Harvey has meant the refinery has shut down, along with many other oil, gas and petrochemical installations on the Gulf. And when operations are halted, the companies then burn off excess chemicals straight into the air. Over the last few days, the Environmental Defense Fund has looked into these industries' filings to regulators and has calculated that
Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Hurricane Harvey's trail of devastation in the heart of the US oil industry. Also this week, remember the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa hold their 9th Emerging Markets Summit. But can the bloc exert an economic force in 2017? Plus, conservationists sound the alarm in the Amazon. A vast reserve in Brazil is at risk of being carved up by mining, and in neighboring Bolivia, a highway through a pristine rainforest is planned. All week long, we've been seeing footage of dazed evacuees gathering in flood shelters in the US state of Texas. Hurricane Harvey has forced nearly 2 million people from their homes in population-dense Houston, America's 4th largest